activity as lecturing, I cannot say what is ending point of my activity here. Obviously, I would say, I want you to understand this or that, but how to measure it? How to say if my activity is adjusted to your understanding? Obviously, it is impossible as for now. So this is probably the case in which I want to achieve many endpoints. For instance, I want you to look at me. I want you to respond to my inquiries. I want you to ask questions. I want you to work with your pen and piece of paper, whatever. I have a number of states which I want to reach together. So it is also the case of cognition, obviously, because sometimes you have one endpoint. When you have a task of calculating, let us say, sum of numbers, you have one end state, the sum of it, that you should express or you should write down, and sometimes it is much more complex when you want, I don't know, to be successful in your studies. Those ending points are numerous, including various courses or other activities in addition to teaching, in addition to learning from your point of view. That's the second remark. The third remark, I have already said it, circular nature of cybernetic systems. What is distinguished in our functioning is data received by means of perception, considered broadly, and action responses to those perceptions, which leads to new perceptual input, new actions, etc. And I hope that at least some of you recognize here James Gibson. Gibson is not a cybernetician, to be frank, but that idea that to characterize our perception, we have to take into account motor activity, to account for distinguishing students on the audience. I have to move around, be closer to you, or look at you from different perspectives. It involves my bodily activity as well. So in that sense, we can see some specific similarities between James Gibson and that idea of circular regulation. And finally, we may ask, okay, so how those processes are implemented, how they are realized, and independence on the system which we are considering means for implementing a cybernetic system or regulation particularly may be done in various ways. When you think about thermostat, when you think about engine, when you think about human being, when you think about society, those adjustments, as you can see, can be implemented in various ways. In the case of human beings, obviously, we assume that it is our nervous activity which allows us to adjust our perceptions to activities and to changes in the environment, but probably not only. I would say that also bodily activity here is important. So once again, what the point shows is how cybernetic approach was broad, and that we as cognitive scientists can take some aspects of it into consideration. As I have said, the most crucial issue here, what you should remember when you think about cybernetics, is informational feedback. Obviously, I don't expect you to remember those dates. They are presented just to locate in time those ideas, but obviously details are not important. The application here, development and application in various areas show just how broad notion it is. If you want to find some very specific and I must say quite famous application, you can Google the name James Watt and his idea of regulation of functioning of the steam engine. That description, I'm not going to provide it here. It's pointless. But if you wish, you can Google it and check that description and find ideas presented by cybernetics. Here, you will find all of them which were mentioned. Here, this is why in handbooks you often can find that example as showing cyberneticians' ideas. Okay, just like in the case of behaviorism, just like in the case of associationism, I want you to try to show that you understand the cybernetic ideas. So I want you to choose a phenomenon from your everyday life and describe it in terms of, sorry, I should be visible to your colleagues. Describe it in terms of cybernetic circle. What I thought about, it may be driving a car, for instance, adjusting speed as an example, but feel free to choose your own example. Be creative, so to say. What I expect you to show you stages. So I act in the world, something changes, I detect those changes, I regulate my behavior, and I perform another action. So I want you to identify those stages with particular stress on feedback, when it happens, and how it works. And the second thing, I want you to show circularity. So whichever event you choose to describe, I should be able to see that it happens again and again and again with subsequent feedbacks and subsequent regulations. As I am delayed with my assessment of your assignments, you have more time than I usually provide. By the middle of December I think is enough. Relevant assignment would be on Virtualny Campus as well. Any questions concerning cybernetics? Any reflections, perhaps comments, perhaps your own examples or whatever? Just remember that I know that I am repeating it again and again. Our main question is how the mind works, or if you wish, from methodological point of view, how to account for our behavior, assuming mindfulness, assuming mental activities. So in reference to cybernetics, we may say our mind works on the basis of informational feedback, being a result of our acting on environment and perceiving changes that happen, and then self-regulation in an answer to those perceived changes. I don't want to say that it is universal principle. For instance, when I think about walking around, when I think about balancing of my body, when I think about, less and less common problems with surface in Lublin, with roads, with pavements, but I can imagine a situation of a hole in this and regulation not to fall down when I encounter such a phenomenon. I think that description in terms of cybernetics is quite convincing. But on the other hand, when I think about such activities as argumentation, as justification one's point of view, as subjective responses to certain stimuli, I'm not sure if cybernetics is here the best framework to account for those phenomena. But, well, once again, I wonder what's your point on this. So can you comment in any way? Can you provide any feedback concerning the content presented and the ideas presented? One more thing follows, and I want you to remember this. According to cybernetics, without informational feedback, there will be no improvement. So if you think that I am not the best one lecturer, I need your feedback to improve myself. If something is not clear, I need your feedback to know it. So this is why I try to, sometimes I try to ask you about your opinion. So, well, it depends. I would say sometimes perhaps we won't be able to survive. We will cease to exist in some cases. And what I think is akinetopsia, for instance, inability to notice movement of objects. I think I mentioned this during our classes. There is this function that happens due to problems with 17th area of our brain in the occipital lobe, when you see words as snapshots. So when you imagine yourself crossing the street with akinetopsia, you do not have relevant feedback in that case. I mean, it is updated not frequently enough. What may be the result? Well, in particular in Poland, it's possible that you would be killed by, not by the car, but by a driver to formulate this program. Yeah? Do you think so? I don't know if it is the right kind of answer. Sometimes results are not so far-reaching. You can imagine that to speed up the whole process of our functioning during that course, I'm not providing you feedback on your assignments. I mean, the feedback is just limited to number of points. The question is if you would benefit it, knowing that you have 3 instead of 4 points or 1 instead of 2. This is why it takes so long, and this is why I provide you more or less detailed description of what I think is good, what I think is wrong. But without that feedback, well, you can function during the course, right? But your functioning would be adjusted to my expectations, for instance. And I can imagine the situation in which lack of feedback won't influence our functioning. I can imagine my old professors, when I was a student, they had their notes prepared 20 years ago, and they're repeating the same statements again and again and again, regardless the audience. Students were not important at those times, in a sense. Yeah, so when you think about car drivers, by the way, ignoring the traffic signs or ignoring that famous formulation that you can read about in newspapers, regardless weather conditions, not adjusted, I mean speed not adjusted to conditions, you have an example of, well, ignored feedback. I think that those people in many cases are still alive. and perhaps even without financial consequences. So it's not necessary always to have feedback, but well, there are also more extreme cases.
Sometimes analyzing every step is not it's an energy consumer.
Yeah, it's also connected. Obviously, that interaction is energy consuming, and processing feedback also requires energy. So good point. I didn't mention this, but yeah, good remark. Any other comment on cyberneticians' ideas? Ideas that disappear. Any other? What do you think about it as a framework for explanation of cognition?
We cannot proceed around this without time flow. So without the time flow.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Obviously, what I missed as well is temporal aspect of functioning of cybernetic systems. They are embedded in their environment. It means that they depend on the circumstances, external circumstances, but they take into account temporal nature of changes that happen in the world. But also what we stress during our classes, discussing attention, for instance. Internal processing, internal adjustment also takes time. And between perception of that feedback and response to that perception, there is also some time necessary to adjust your behavior. To return once again to this car example, this is why it is stressed that distance is important, because you need time to brake, for instance, in unexpected circumstances. So that temporal aspect is important as well. Thank you once again. Mm-hmm. Any other comment? Do you feel like a cybernetic system? You do not help me with lack of feedback. Okay, so I want to encourage you to try to express some activity in those terms. As I have said, it may be important in the context of an exam, because when I provide you a feedback, it is feedback with expectations that I have during an exam, and some of exam questions would be related to those assignments. So it is good to have what you prepared in the proper and in the wrong way. Okay, so we have another framework for explaining a mind. And to sum it up with some features that seems to me important from the point of view of cognitive science, to stress once again the way in which I consider cognitive science. So you almost all of you started your explanation, why are you here, with stressing interdisciplinarity. So cybernetics was an interdisciplinary project. The variety of systems in which that framework was applied is one of the aspects of this interdisciplinarity. Origins with biological systems and subsequent applications in artifacts shows an attempt to connect those areas of our of our life. And what I have said is just stressed in the next statement. Once again, if you remember, when I characterized behaviorism, I said that an advantage of behaviorism is the behaviorists try to apply common framework to various living organisms. So at some level, my behavior and behavior of a dog, of an octopus, or of a bird may be treated as similar. Here we have the same situation. Researchers attempted to find some principles which are common to various species, and not only species, which can be used in construction of artificial systems as well. I said that it is an advantage. Obviously, you may disagree. You may say that you want to show that human beings are unique and they in important aspects different from other species. Then you won't look for commonalities, but rather for differences. I mentioned today that term appeared, embodiment. When you think about cognition in terms of Nenska's and others' handbook, you may recall that definition: mind is information processing systems. Information is delivered, transformed by senses, and what is cognition? It happens inside us. Cyberneticians stressed that the idea that it is not internal neural processing which is important. They stress the fact that body is important factor in cognition. We express it by the term embodiment of a cognitive system. So to put it differently, we recently discussed during our classes attention, and we try to characterize attention in terms which do not refer to varieties of bodies. According to cyberneticians, those differences in bodies is important. In this sense, cognition, as characterized in the case of human being or an octopus, where we differ in our embodiment, should be slightly differently characterized in the sense of means of providing feedback, for instance. Anyway, what they wanted to study is not just internal mechanism, but also body as mediating between the world and internal processes. I have said that dates are not important. Sometimes names are important. This is why I want you remember that name, Norbert Wiener, treated as the father of cybernetics. I should have a picture of him, yeah. He defined it, as you can see on the slide, cybernetics, the science of control and communication in animal and the machine. And well, I can imagine cognitive scientists who would characterize cognitive science in the same way or very similar way. That's why I think that it is relevant for our studies, for your interests. And another argument in contrast, I would say, to that information processing paradigm introduced by cognitive psychologists, we have an alternative approach presented by Tim van Gelder, Australian cognitive scientist, well, not so recently, the so-called idea of dynamical systems. If you remember, because I mentioned today that toilet paper game and computation, Van Gelder says we may treat cognition differently, and it is reflected in the title of his famous paper, What Made Cognition Be If Not Computation? What it may be, dynamic interaction with an environment, which is clearly development of cybernetic ideas. So this age-old idea, I would say, has its more contemporary, more recent incarnations, but I won't discuss it with you until the 6th semester of cognitive science program. Perhaps some my colleagues would refer to it earlier. Anyway, what I want you to remember, I know that it is repetition. You have to keep in mind alternative accounts of mind, of mental function. And this is why I questioned during our first meeting on cognitive psychology, somehow I questioned the universal application of that information processing paradigm as presented by Nenska and others. Okay, so it is up to you to assess how cybernetic approach is relevant for you or for your view on cognition. I just want to encourage you to think about this. Okay, I want to present two more ideas very briefly, but I think that they are important in the context of development of thinking about cognition. What does it mean? What is mind? How to characterize it? And during our classes, I tried to stress that regardless various approaches, mind should be treated as a system. It's not uniform, it's not unity, as some philosophers said, it is complex entity. So a system. This is why I decided to present shortly the so-called general systems theory as described by Ludwig von Bertalanffy. Once again, I should have his picture. It will appear in a while. Bertalanffy attempted to answer the question, what is a system? And starting analysis of various entities that he treated as systems, once again, it is broad scope of phenomena that he studied, he distinguished between open systems, which exchange certain, well, how to say it, certain things. I do not have the right word now. With an environment, it may be matter, it may be energy, it may be information, for instance. And classical example are living organisms, which interact in that way that they exchange something with an environment, and rather rare situations of systems which do not engage in such exchanges. And to be honest, in his study on general systems theory, Bertalanffy ignores the second ones as not interesting. What he focuses in are open systems. So the rest of the story concerns his studies on open systems. So the first thing, a system should be treated as a whole. Even if certain system, for instance, an organism consists of a number of various subsystems, they work as a whole. Why it is important? Because you may ask, okay, so if I am consisting of memory mechanisms, attentional mechanisms, representational mechanisms, perceptual mechanisms, action mechanisms, what is that connects them all in one subject? So Bertalanffy said those various processes cooperate as a whole. They interact. Obviously, there are interactions between them, and you know it already. But they work together to sustain existence of an organism as a whole. So it is important. And the second thing, which is tightly connected with cybernetic ideas, if we ask a question, okay, so what's the role of such a system working as a whole? It is achieve some state of equilibrium. So if you look, for instance, you as an organism, if you look for best conditions in which you can live, if, for instance, you look for weather like today in September, as I did, you move to some other part of Europe to find those conditions because they are connected with your criteria, with optimal conditions in which you can function. So it's the second thing. For various systems, we can at least try to indicate distinguished state to which certain organism is trying to achieve. And once again, when you think once again about a thermostat, such a state of equilibrium can be established as one. But when you think about you as a human being, definitely there are various such states. Why? Because you try to achieve optimal biological conditions, but on the other hand, you try to keep your psychic side as keeping certain level that you would describe as the level of psychological comfort. So we have at least two dimensions. So that it is not always the case that they can work together. Forgive me too simplistic example, but you can imagine a situation in which your body requires higher temperatures to function properly. So this is why in winter you move to let us say Italy or Spain to comfort your body, but at the same time you need friends to talk with them, to share experience with them. And that unlucky situations is that you have friends at the north of Europe. So you have to choose. Comforting your body, you won't comfort your psychological aspect of functioning. Comforting the psychological side, you won't comfort your body. Obviously, it is simplification, dramatic simplification, but to show you that we are not as simple as thermostat, which can achieve that state of equilibrium in one dimension just. Right? Is it understandable? So once again, to answer the question, what's the basic feature of the system, is to answer the question why those various aspects of functioning of a system can be combined together to provide some level which, well, requires compromise sometimes. I'm not sure if we can treat human beings from cognitive point of view as consisting of such huge unlimited number of conditions, but yeah, at least we have problem with squaring together, with combining together our activities in various conditions and to achieve various levels of satisfactions, various dimensions, not various levels, I would say better. Once again, I am presenting that statement, but I won't account for it because I don't think that Bertalanffy managed to justify it. He was convinced that we can, as you can see on the slide, achieve true level of that equilibrium because of our capacity to use language, to use symbols, to communicate. So we go beyond purely interactive aspects. We have also conventional aspects because symbolism means reliance on convention, and reference to language implies communication and exchange of ideas. Okay. Any comment on this? Once again, trying to address our question, what is mind? Mind is a system, an open system, exchanging various things with its environment, trying to achieve certain level of equilibrium in various dimensions, and doing this, among others, by means of language, by means of symbolic communication. So that would be Bertalanffy's answer to our problem. And once again, it is you who should assess if any aspect of that approach can be applied to cognitive phenomena. If you can, for instance, treat, as the authors say, attention as uniform system of processes. Any comment? Perhaps you disagree? Yeah? It may be. We exchange energy with an environment, we exchange information, but it is not necessary. You can think about, I don't know, animals as exchanging such things, but you can think also as temperature regulating devices as exchanging certain things with environment. You can think about the kettle as exchanging energy with environment. So just like in the case of cybernetics, it is very broad scope of application, and what differentiates mind and the kettle is complexity. And yeah, they might passively receive some and changes of their state result in changes in environment. It doesn't require activity.
They're passive. Receive information.
I would say that we should consider passive systems at that time, because any action would result in exchange of energy, for instance. I'm not sure, I didn't study that aspect, but I think that Bertalanffy would have problems with indicating example of a closed system.
Yeah, I think so. Because, for example, the rod is a closed system, but when you don't use it, it's maybe the closed
But when you use something, for instance, when I am using this thing, a new system emerges, consisting of me and that thing. So we would have an open system consisting of an open system and closed system. Yeah, thank you. Any other idea, doubt, comment? In what sense?
There's always just only one true answer. Elimination. Like information.
I wonder which of the processes provides one correct answer.
Information for the
But in specific, what do you mean? Because yeah, but all of them, is it? We started with an observation that we are not truth-making systems. We are systems that try to survive. And I can treat some aspects of the world in proper way. I can misrepresent them, for instance. And despite misrepresentation, it is possible that I will survive still. I may be wrong, but on the basis of wrong convictions, I may still be alive. For instance, well, I can imagine that I am convinced that the Earth is flat. And somewhere far away, we have edge of that huge circle, for instance, or rectangle, or whatever. And unless I will try to reach that point and observe what happens there, that false conviction doesn't influence my function, doesn't influence my capacity to survive. In this sense, I am not, to be honest, I'm not convinced to the idea that cognitive processes, information processing should lead to one and the only proper answer, valid answer. And when you think about representing activity, we said at the very beginning, representation assumes errors. Representation is always aspectual. So some misconception of the world is included in the very process of representing the world. But definitely we can discuss the issue, what does it mean that we try to eliminate, as you said, improper alternatives and focus on the proper one. But I don't think that we can do this in general. We can do this focusing on particular processes. And if you wish, we can discuss it. What do you think?
Well, I think that information always like we have some things that's not finished.
Yeah. And what we stressed when we discussed what is attention, we are very limited in this respect. Not sensitive to all the informational differences that are in the world. Those may be reasons. Okay. Anyway, my intention is not to quote particular statements of this or that cognitive scientist, philosopher, or neurobiologist, whoever, but to see consequences for the idea of cognition and idea of the mind. Okay, and final idea that I want to present today. Kenneth Craig, I would call him one of the earliest cognitive scientists focusing on neurobiology. As you can see, he died very early. It's not important, but perhaps interesting. He died in an accident when he was cycling. A truck collided with him. He didn't finish his idea of brain as a modeling machine, and that idea will be of my particular focus now. I mean, what does it mean, the brain models, and what is the notion of a model, which will direct us toward the next topic of our lectures, namely cognitive psychology. So Kenneth Craig, once again, I am mentioning him in the context of cybernetics because he tried to look for similarities in the process of controlling. When we think about how functioning of a thermostat, of an engine, of a train, of a car is controlled, we may ask the question, okay, so how this way of controlling activity of artificial devices can be related to controlling activity of natural living creatures. So to repeat once again, cyberneticians try to find some common factors in this respect, and Kenneth Craig starts with such an attitude as well. So the crucial word here would be similarity. When you compare various processes, you may see similarity in subsequent stages. You can see similarity in units that influence each other. And Craig was convinced that focus on the way in which our brain functions may answer the questions about cognition. So the second crucial term here that I want to refer to is the notion of a model. According to Kenneth Craig, the main activity of the brain is creation, as you can see on the slide, of models of external world in our brain. So the question, what is the main idea of Kenneth Craig should be reformulated. What does it mean that brain models external, I mean extraneural reality? What's the sense of the word model here in his sense? Trying to formulate questions asked by Kenneth Craig in terms more familiar to you, we can ask, okay, so why certain brain state is representation of certain world state? When you say that activity of occipital lobe, some area of occipital lobe represents movement of objects, you may be forced to answer the question why it is such a representations. And as some philosophers answer that question, saying brain state should correspond to certain aspect of the world. So this answer forces us to once again analyze the term correspondence. What does it mean that there is correspondence between brain state and world state? And some of you, if there is a student who started to read a paper on a frog, you should see one possible answer to that question. That paper that I asked you to read a week ago tries to say, what does it mean in the case of frog that certain neural activity corresponds to certain detectable events in the world? But that answer that you can find in Letwin, Maturana, and others' paper won't satisfy Craig. He tries to answer it differently, and to answer his questions, I want to interact a little bit with you now. Namely, I want you to express your idea of a model. I want to provide a definition of a model together with you. So if you have such two phenomena, would you say that one of them is a model of a second one, and why? If not, also, I want to hear why. Would you say that one of them is the model of another one? Still not. That's the question. If you say that there is significant similarity, and if you say that it may be the case that it is a model of that because of similarity, that's what I am asking about. So copying some features maybe by some people treated as indicating of presence of a model. Representation of the same object. Please do not use the term representation. it only complicates.
Okay, so it's shown the same.
What I want to stress, the term model is not synonymous with the term representation. Please do not treat it in the same way. Why? I hope you will see. So, once again, would you treat one of them as model of another one?
All of them are at the same order. Represent the same subject.
Please do not refer to represent. It is original, actual device, locomotive, and it is small scale model of it. Plate with such models, you know. So would you treat one of them as a model of another?
Yeah.
Why?
I would like to come back to the presentation again.
No, please do not. It won't answer our question. Because you explain something ununderstandable but something equal ununderstandable. Yeah?
This model because it let us gives us possibility of interacting the same way with one and another, but in the small scale.
What do you mean? If I can throw it
It has
or drop it on the surface, do you think that I can do?
No, but you can possibly interpret. I mean, put small object in bigger scale, and on that example, imagine how it will be looks. I mean, it has the same exactly proportions and color and.
So still similarity is the feature. Okay, so perhaps functioning of a model is somehow connected with similarity. Any other ideas? Would you treat one of them as model of another one as well? With that restriction, do not use the word representation. Do not use that art word. What do you think? What do you think? Yeah. So you said something about this one. Why this should be a model of this one? Okay, so you mean, I try to understand it. Do you mean that it functions in specific circumstances? For instance, it requires tracks or network of tracks. Is that what you meant or something else? If not, let me know. What else? Who thinks that one of those objects is a model of another? According to Emma Craig, similarity of physical details is similarity of circumstances in which something functions as units, but the number is not enough. So I didn't achieve my goal tonight. So perhaps another ideas. Obviously, I am not asking you about proper definition. That's what I want to present at the end. You ask you about what suggestion may be helpful.
That's similar functions.
What do you mean?
Like it's as a system, it works the same way. I mean, as real train moves back and forward, and the model does exactly the same. Exactly the same. The model as train requires electricity, maybe in smaller scale, but similar.
Mhm.
And so it may makes similar noises as well.
Is that the one who's trying to describe the other?
Once again?
The one who's trying to describe the other.
Yeah. Also, let me return to the light. Yeah, I agree with you with one exception. The function of this is to allow people to travel. The function of this is to engage children, let us say, or sometimes adults in a kind of play. So at this level, functions are different, but I agree with you that functioning of that one and functioning of that one is somehow similar. Either in terms of mechanisms, electrical engines, although different, but similar principles, or in the broad sense, as you said, moving along the tracks, or connecting and pulling carriages. So yeah, it is important. And now back to you.
One of those objects is trying to describe the other.
I would say we can try to describe. We can try to use one of them to describe the other.
It's created the object, trying to do like that.
Because that thing here in itself doesn't describe anything. We can describe it.
We can put in a context of what kind of train really exists.
Yeah. So it's also important point. We can talk about this in terms of this or the other way. It depends on your focus. Any other observation? Why one of them, I want you to notice, I didn't say what is a model and what is an original. Because it depends. One of them can be treated as a model of another one.
Yeah, actually, it's not the free to the tool, it's the original concept, the true.
Excuse me, once again, the beginning.
So at the beginning, I was trying the real train as a continuation of the first one. It was a model that was showing how the train should go, which should look like or something like that. It's the concept, not a tool.
Yeah. Which shows that modeling relationship depends on the perspective in a sense. Okay. We are not very helpful. I mean, the majority of the group today. So thank you for your engagement. Another example. You have an actual picture of part of the city of Lund in Sweden, and here you have screenshot of the relevant part of Google Maps covering that actual piece of terrain. So would you treat that Google Map thing as a model of real city, at least part of the city, or perhaps the other way? And most important, why? Or would you say, no, it's not a model? You have two objects, one in the world, the city of Lund, one, well, in a sense, virtual Google map.
Can it be similar if the one strength is better?
In what sense it is similar? I mean, let's forget about trains. Let's talk about maps and cities.
Well, we can, you said, the one strength is maybe others.
The one
is the one strength to describe the other.
Yeah. Yeah, but those are two different things. And talk about description, you mean that you can reflect in some language relationship, for instance, between that building and that place, which, to be honest, now is a bit different. And you can describe that relationship by referring to this grayish element reflecting that building and those things here. That's one aspect, description. But navigation is another aspect connected with our activity. I can act on the world on the basis of its model.
It's coming out of place and we cannot from a little perspective.
Yeah. Definitely the way of orienting one and another may be here important. So to add a new feature to our initial analysis of a model, we may say that something may be a model of something else if I can act on the original on the basis of information provided by the model. Would you accept it? Does it is consistent with your idea of a model or not? And the second thing that you mentioned, I can describe the original by means of information provided by the model, which is something little different. And the other comment on this example. Yeah.
So if the model has the same categories of features of which the original one, we could say that this model, for example, streets on buildings in the Google Maps model. On the street is a true fact that is located in the street. So it was like a diorama with exactly these buildings or with it's trees, yes, with trees or streets, we could say that this diorama is a model street. And we could navigate, we could use.
So what would be important for you would be categorization provided by the model that can be applied in reality.
Yes, it's like if the model shows the true self of the technical suppose the facts street. So we can say that this is model.
Yeah, very good point. I mean about categorization, because what does it mean that you can categorize?
The thing that we can some objects or make a category from the different types of objects and use them for one categories.
Yeah, excellent. The point is that I interrupted to let your colleagues talk with themselves without interrupting them in their talk. But you did what I should do. Excellent point. Categorization allows differentiation. So if we have here categories of streets, buildings, places, whatever, and if you can on that basis distinguish relevant elements in reality, perhaps it is one of the functions of the model. Okay, that's not a computer. The third example. I don't know if you have seen that building in Lublin. It was recently renovated, so perhaps you saw it in the newspapers. On the one hand, and we have description of that object. On the other hand, my question is, would you treat that description as a model of that building? Would you treat it as a model of that building? Yeah.
Next, it is trying to describe the objects. Matches my definition, as I say.
So you would see the first role of the model to describe the original or our capacity. Well, a little bit tricky distinction because we have to distinguish between our capacity to describe one thing in terms of another or description itself, as you can see here. Okay, so you would treat it as a model, yeah? What about the rest of the group? Would you treat it as a model or not? And why? If you are bored on the other side of Zoom, you can vote and provide your votes on the chat. Is it a model or not? Sorry, it's not possible to interact with real audience and virtual audience, at least for me. My attention is too limited. So, would you treat it? Yeah, why? So in principle, if instead of changes that happened with that building, if we have had here information about some dimensions of it, you would treat it then as a model. So it's not the problem in description. The problem, according to you, is in the content, in the what is said. Okay.
That allows us to interact with the real object. I mean, reads only the word wieża. We already know that we have to look for something which is probably higher than one.
Yes.
Buildings.
Yes, the text set is a Greek tower, so we can see something. Can imagine something.
I'm not imagining the point that we can still operate on reality based on the other text providers.
Yeah, you can identify it if you know the way in which. Okay. So we have differences. That's what I like. Differences create. Well, yeah. Ultimately, I wanted to say that it's placed a discussion about another thing. Is it model or not? Yes, no, or gosh, how long it was. What do you say? students do that can be for each of them understand question context and it's important to express yourself. It's not about being right or being wrong, but about trying to achieve a context which we call common understanding of a mode. That, as you can see, what we do today, we can try to describe in terms of ideas presented, and I want you to see. So, any other opinion on this issue? What about voting? Is there anyone on the other side of Zoom? Or you are brushing your teeth or eating breakfast? So, nothing, no feedback, yeah.
It's hard to decide whether the feedback or not because the description says that, okay, it says what it is, but it doesn't say how it was built. I mean, the shape of the building. It seems like we need some kind of scheme that the model presents.
So you would still require some similarity.
Yes, I guess.
So you are, I think you present the most extreme approach because your colleague said, okay, it may be a description, but concerning other features, if you say, if I understand you properly, that some kind of schema, so something similar visually, for instance, would be here necessary for something to be a model. Yeah, thank you. So there is no one and the only answer. I know that it is 15 past. If you have to leave, you can leave. But I want to present two definitions, and I want you, before next lecture, I want you to assess what about my questions, what about answers, what about those three examples. So first of all, we have Kenneth Craig's idea. By a model, we thus mean any physical or chemical system which has a similar relation structure to that of the process it imitates. Think about the first example. By relation structure, I do not mean some obscure non-physical entity which attends to the model, but the fact that it is a physical working model which works in the same way as the process it parallels. I want to remind your colleagues' remark on working of those two, that toy and actual device, in the aspect under consideration at any moment. So as you remember, Craig asked why brain processes model some world processes. Why? Because they work in the same or perhaps similar way as those that they imitate. And the second, more recent definition provided by Marvin Minsky says, we use the term model in the following sense. To an observer B, so what is a model depends on you, an object A star is a model of an object A to the extent that B can use A star to answer some questions about A. So if you can use a model to answer some questions about original, then you mean model properly, according to Marvin Minsky. And it is your task. Please do not have to send me it via email, but please think about this in your free time. Which of the examples were models, in what sense, and why? Because definitely the notion of a model would return again and again. I am going to start my next lecture on cognitive psychology, and I will talk about psychological models of cognition, and I will then need one of the notions of the model presented here. Okay, the time has passed. Thank you for your presence. Please remember that feedback is important, so please do be active, interact during next meetings. Have a nice day, whatever. Thermostat in terms of cybernetics functioning, and you can